So yeah, again, my name's Quinton Pratt, and in my team also is Stephanie Manson. So we both work in the propagated and research material team in plant import operations in the department. So under our purview, obviously, as we do the nursery stock pathway, there are separate pathways for seed and research materials and stock feed and stuff that are distributed in not only our team but sort of across the branch. And I guess, just in terms of the presentation itself today, I mean, my understanding really the key theme was to kind of give an overview really, in broad terms, I guess, of the process for importing, from our perspective, nursery stock goods into Norfolk Island. So I guess that's the flavour, and then, we can get into the weeds of things as we, get to the Q&A session. So anyway, in that flavour, I guess, this, whoops, sorry, here we go, technology, how does it work? This is just really, and I'm sure people are probably largely across this, but just to give you an overview of like the what's and the whys of regulation. So, again, I think everyone's probably pretty clued up, but it kind of just sets some of the landscape, I think, for some of the later slides. From a plant perspective, in terms of why the regulation side of things, we're really about, for us, plant-based goods into Australia, and covered off on nursery stock, which is my focus, obviously, and then seed, timber, like fresh fruit and veg, cut flowers, plant products, and any plant-based stock feed. And then probably, it might, some people don't always see the distinction, but in terms of the nursery stock and seed pathway, while they're both sort of propagative, very distinct pathways in terms of risk profile and volumes and the like, and so there's a bit of a division of responsibility there. So on the nursery stock side of things, the key things are really talking about tissue cultures and bulbs and cuttings, bare rooted, so that's really in my stream of the team. So I know just in that context too, like there was a seed inquiry I think that came through the week, so it's not technically sort of in our lunchbox, but so moving on to the next bit, it's obviously, what are we actually regulating? So, and obviously for Australia for a whole, so this presentation will be a little bit mainly in Australia, the international border, and then we'll do sort of dive down into the Norfolk side of things, but and obviously Australia as a whole, as well as the AETs, it's good. There's a favourable sort of pest and disease status, and the department imposes, obviously a range of conditions, sort of pre through to post border, to stop, new things being introduced, established, and spread of a particular quarantine concern. And then, obviously we impose kind of a range of measures to address a lot of these key pests that either impact directly the health of plants or the humans or the environment, and that includes, like key things like thrips and mites and nematodes. Obviously, we also regulate vectors, which may be pests that not necessarily quarantinable in of themselves, but they can carry or transmit some pathogens that are a particular quarantine concern. And then, of course, we move into a lot of the disease-causing agents and pathogens such as bacteria, viruses, viroids, fungi, and phytoplasmas. We obviously regulate the plants themselves. So, are they permitted species? Are they particularly weedy or noxious weeds? And then we have a whole range of other sort of contaminant material that can be associated with imports, such as soil and trash and seeds, algae, or things such as contaminating pests that are not typically, directly associated with the pathway, but can still be, can transit with them. So moving on to the next slide. And so, this particular slide, we're just looking at how we manage the pest and disease risks. So, obviously the department deploys, a suite of standard measures for imported goods to prevent the introduction and establishment and post-arrival factors. But and this slide's just really focusing on those standard management approaches that kind of apply at our international border. And this can include like quite an arsenal of measures. So anything from pre-export factors before the goods are actually arriving in Australia, and obviously on arrival where the goods are maintained, are still maintained under biosecurity control and undergo all the verification steps to ensure the goods meet our requirements before being released. And then obviously that also covers post-entry for some pathways. So, goods are often, even though they pass the inspection on arrival, they'll often go a period of post-entry quarantine for monitoring and testing prior to release actually happening. And then in terms of the post-entry too, in the event that something goes wrong, you've got an incursion of something fairly significant, it's escaped biosecurity control, and we don't want it, then there's a whole area of the department that also deals with post-border responses and traceback and containment and eradication in those situations, which I believe was sort of one flavour that came up this week in the Norfolk context. So starting on the pre-export side of things, obviously consignments will undergo an inspection by the exporting country, their NPPO, before it arrives here, and they'll issue a certificate, essentially, which is a testament that the consignment it's been treated in accordance, basically met all our conditions. So it's been treated, it's been inspected, verified that it's free from key pests and diseases of concern. And then we obviously have an application of like a suite of targeted measures, and they can either be like singly applied or in combination to manage the risk of the pathway. So they could be like, a chemical or a physical treatment, so like a fumo or heat or whatever the like, at an approved sort of schedule or rate that ensures that pests have been appropriately managed. That can also include testing, and that can either be done onshore or offshore to validate that a pathogen in particular is not associated with goods. And it can also be like a systems approach, and that's usually like a complement of measures. So two or more typically, and that will collectively together manage the risk and reduce the likelihood of introduction. So, and then obviously the other mechanism we have is for maintaining goods under PEQ for a period of monitoring and testing, and that doesn't, depends on the pathway, doesn't apply to all pathways, but for a lot of medium risk and high risk, it does. And then it's also like an available option, like if goods are not compliant at the border during an inspection. So sometimes they can go in for a period of PEQ for monitoring. That just provides the department with a bit of additional confidence that the risks have been managed too. So, and just moving on to this particular slide. So first one's just really a lens, obviously, at an international border, and now we're kind of diving down a bit more into conditions, or that general suite of conditions and how it applies to a Norfolk context. So obviously with the transition of biosecurity management to the department in 2016, the onus has fallen to the department to develop a set of conditions to allow trade to happen and safely. And so I've kind of highlighted here some of the key distinctions, I guess, to account for practically what can happen in Norfolk. So, obviously inspection and certification, there's no problems there. That obviously can be applied across the board. Just requires a certification pre-export by the exporting state body, and then obviously there's a verification inspection that's conducted on arrival in Norfolk by our biosecurity officers there. In terms of the measures though, this is where things get a little bit different and need to be a little bit more pragmatic. They sort of account for there being limited ability to sort of do some of these treatments to consignments after they arrive in Norfolk. So, needing to have things like a certified fumigator or an approved arrangement facility that's been certified by the department to conduct the treatment, or capacity to fumigate sort of high volume insect treatments across the consignment. So that's one of the key limitations, obviously, in Norfolk. And one of the other limitations is around post-entry quarantine. So as I mentioned, some of the plants will either have a defined PEQ period as part of their import conditions when they come into mainland Australia, or again, it can be a remedial option if things go wrong with the consignment. But there isn't any PEQ capacity in Norfolk, so that's again another limitation in terms of the measures that need to be developed to facilitate that trade. And then the other key limitation really in a Norfolk context is around diagnostics. So similar to the sort of treatment example, there's only limited capacity to do this on the island. So any complex diagnostics really Either needs to be done remotely with photography using mainland diagnosticians, which is obviously not easy, but a bit of a difficult process. It isn't definitive, or alternatively, you've got to sort of go through some more complicated permit route to send samples for more definitive diagnostics to happen, which isn't really feasible in real time. It's quite tedious, it's time consuming, and particularly when you're often talking about perishable goods at the border, they tend to degrade quite significantly and can be quite a significant limitation. So obviously developing conditions, therefore, like sort of most factors come into play. And so, I guess the key things in development of cases for plant commodities going into Norfolk is that material obviously needs to be sourced from the mainland, number one, because you don't have PQ, like they do for importing into Australian mainland. And then you've got, so the other practical thing, sorry, just having a little bit of a think there, is that just taking into effect your goods determination, so the legislative sort of allowances that are currently prescribed for Norfolk. We need to factor those in, as well as sort of domestic movement pathways, while balancing that while still trying to preserve Norfolk's sort of biosecurity status. So, and then obviously without having sort of a suite of treatments available to conduct on arrival if there is a problem, that sort of necessitates a more precautionary approach and requiring treatments to be conducted pre-export on the mainland before actually moving over to Norfolk. So, so taking all that into kind of account, our risk assessment colleagues have developed sort of a set of conditions, and they're sort of being allocated into 3 separate cases for movement of goods into Norfolk. And that really covers off on dormant bulbs, and there's a separate case for cuttings and bare-rooted plants, and then the last one's obviously for tissue cultures as well. So that's how the case structure is designed for when you want to put through an application through the Department for Nursery Stock. In this one, I'm just sort of drilling down a little bit to the individual cases that are permitted. So it's just giving you an overview of what measures need to be met under each of these cases. I've kind of grouped the bulbs, cuttings with the cuttings and bare-rooted case, because fundamentally, like most of the requirements are essentially the same. There's just a couple of nuances. So, there's a lot of sort of basic fundamental requirements to a lot of these that go across all the case structures, and obviously the key one is that, one, you need to have a valid import permit. So nursery stock is a permit pathway under your goods determination, and I think the only exception is like our goods determination, where for live orchids imported as tissue culture and brought in as passenger baggage, that's the only one. The alternative conditions under the GD, which doesn't require a permit. And that's distinct from seed under your GD as well. Each consignment also needs to be accompanied by a plant health certificate, which has been issued by a state or territory authority of the exporting state that you're seeking to import goods from. There's a lot of standard conditions around the goods needing to be clean and free of insect pests, disease, soil media, contaminants, and any other sort of biosecurity risk material, and then accounting for there not being any sort of practical treatments available or PQ provisions on arrival in Norfolk. The goods need to be actually treated before being exported from the mainland, and so this requires treatment with both an insecticide and a fungicide. So the insecticide's our sort of standard department approved amycloprid treatment. And then there's a number of sort of fungicidal options that are stipulated in permit conditions also. The other thing which is worth noting too is that those treatments need to be applied under the oversight of the officer in the state or territory that's issuing the plant health certificate, so they can certify that the treatment's been completed properly, as well as the inspection, their inspection results, so say that it's met the conditions. So that's, I think I just covered that a little bit too there. So there needs to be an inspection, and that'll address all the sort of pest and disease and soil related contaminants risks. And then, yeah, some very generic requirements around the goods need to be secured for movement, so securely wrapped and then shipped with that plant health certificate with the goods to allow the on-arrival officers to verify docs and the like, and obviously ensure like integrity of the consignment. And then, yeah, there'll be an on-arrival inspection obviously by our department officers in Norfolk Island there, and they'll do docs verification, check labelling, look for pest status, and just generally make sure that the goods have met all of the required import conditions. And then obviously in terms of outcomes, if there's no issues detected on arrival, obviously, then everything's good, the consignment will be released. Obviously, if there are sort of pest and disease sections of quarantine concern and kind of factor in the no treatment or PEQ availability on the island, then the consignments are directed for export or disposal. And then just for these bulbs versus the cuttings and bed ready cases. So these are sort of an aggregation of all the common conditions across both cases, but there are some little nuances. So for the cuttings and bed ready case, there's some size restrictions on the plant, so it's no greater than 10 centimetres in diameter. I think it can't be longer than 1.5 metres in length. And the only one I think for bulbs is it needs to be grown and packed in Australia. And then moving to tissue cultures, again, it's a lot of the key sort of fundamental requirements, so sourced from the mainland, inspected and free from infection, diseases, sanitised to contamination. There's a plant health certificate, securely wrapped again, fully properly identified with its botanical name. In terms of the more nuanced differences for tissue cultures, so there's obviously no pre-export treatment that's required for tissue cultures. Tissue cultures, relatively speaking, are a much lower risk pathway. And so, they're typically produced in sterile conditions using clean mother stock material. The containers in which the cultures are imported, they need to be visually clear, so the inspector can actually do a proper inspection of the goods. Can't be opaque, can't have like broken glass. There's a few requirements around the media, so with tissue cultures that are imported into Australia with media. Obviously the media is a nice little sugar soup for things to grow on, and sort of helps identify if there's any contaminations associated with those particular goods. So it needs to be clean and sterile. There is a requirement for the media to be solid, so it can't be all broken up. It needs to be one integral block, which covers all the plant rootlets. There's an establishment requirement too with media, so you can't just, let's say you've got some contaminated plants, you can't just sort of take them out, clean them up and then shove them back in a bag with some media. It needs to be some sort of demonstration that the plants have actually been implanted in the media in the container in which they've been imported into Norfolk. And then, do the on-arrival inspection again. And for the tissue culture pathway, at least, obviously, with the plant health certificates, you're not covering off on treatments. So, in terms of the state or territory officer, it's really just certifying the goods meet the conditions and obviously attesting to the inspection having occurred and being free of all the key things. And I don't know whether this was something you necessarily wanted to cover off on, Philip, because I wasn't too sure about what level you kind of wanted to pitch things at, but we did have a couple of slides on just the mechanics of going through the sort of the application process for getting a permit to Norfolk. Do you think it's worth going through that?
Perhaps we could just spend maybe a minute or two on that. Don't spend too much time, because for our community members here that will talk after you finish, they'll talk to their experience with it, if not the exact Bicon portal online.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, because I only mentioned it because I think we had one application earlier in the year where a Norfolk permit had been progressed through a different case, and that led to the person being charged. And for all our other imported assessments, there's fees associated with it, but for Norfolk, we don't cost recover that activity, and so getting refunds can be a bit of a headache. So anyway, I just thought I would maybe just go through these particular slides. So the easiest way, obviously, you go to Bicon. I usually just untick that. If you tick the Norfolk checkbox there, and maybe just type in, oops, wrong computer, goods, then search. And hopefully this is working very slowly. There we go. And then this case will come up, importing goods into Australian external territory. So you click that, and then tick Norfolk, go next. And it will take you to the case conditions, and then for applying for a permit, you will go apply now. I'm not logged in, but you need an account, so you need to register for an account, and then there's a process that you go through there, and that'll just prompt you to do provide, sort of a bunch of details, obviously, to finalise the permit application. So there'll be stuff like your name and contact information, whether you have an existing permit, and then details of what exactly it is you're trying to import. So I'll just jump back. Sorry, I put the slides up here just in case the computer had a connection. And then, this bit was just in terms of the assessments itself. So it sounded like there might have been a bit of curiosity about how we go about assessing those permits. And then, so obviously as the first here, we'll go through and look at the details that are provided in the permits and make sure that all the required information has been provided. And then at a final level, we will also conduct an assessment, which is more focused around, should it be permitted into Norfolk? And in that context, it sort of throws back to some of the stuff I was saying earlier. So you've got your current GD, which does not require for permits essentially for seeds already listed on the permitted seed list or seeds sourced from mainly in Australia. So we factor that in. We also look at sort of Norfolk Island survey publications to see what is notably published as being present on Norfolk as well. And then, so essentially if it's on the PSL, the permitted seed list already, and it's already present in Norfolk, there's not much of a red blue lever there for us to knock a request back. But we also factor in weed risk status, and so we have a separate area in the department that does our weed risk analyses, and we review obviously their repository of existing assessments that have been done and existing advice, and so we piggyback off that, and if there's any uncertainty or nothing's been done, then we sort of engage with that area further to get advice on whether there's any weedy risks posed. And then following that, we obviously make a recommendation. Once we've got all the required information and advice needed, we'll make a recommendation on the permit. And then I thought, not sure if this is useful or not, Philip, but I don't know if there's any questions around the sort of issuance of the plant health certificate. So anyway, I'll put a couple of links in this slide as a bit of a reference point on that. But basically the plant health certificate, it's just part of the domestic certification system, the scheme for domestic trade within Australia, and so it's issued by state territory officers, as well as there's provisions there for accredited officers to do those as well for movements between the states and territories. There is information, if you Google it, on some of the individual state and territory websites, which sounds like contacts and fees and documentation requirements for booking inspections and issuing those certificates, and they're probably a good sort of start point for people to get onto. There's also the ICA site link that I've got there, which is also in import permits that get issued for Norfolk. They sort of give a bit of an overview of that certification process too, and that's the entry for the ACA site there, And then, in terms of that, like I said before, the certifying officer will need to be present on the mainland to do the inspection of the goods and treatment applications. So, not tissue cultures in that context. And I think that's me in terms of the plant side of things. So thank you. And then I just wait. We do, if you have questions or any concerns that you need clarification on, like import permits, either applications or approved approvals or conditions that you need to meet, or I know there's been some concerns earlier in the year about the cases and the measures that are in place potentially not being amenable to some export trade, as some of the commentary I've heard. But yeah, I mean, we're happy to receive any of those. You can send them through the imports@agriculture.gov.au inbox.
No problem.
I might just flick over to Chiara if she wants to.
Yeah, if we could, we'll just jump straight to Chiara then. Thank you.
Thank you. Alright, just give me a second to get set up here. Alright. So, firstly, thank you for having me here. Just to recap, my name's Chiara Wilson. I'm a Senior Technical Officer in the Veterinary Biologicals and Animal Feeds team in the Animal and Biological Imports branch. I firstly just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the branch I work in. So there are 5 teams within it, and the commodities that we regulate are split up based on the biosecurity risks that they pose. So up here on the screen, I've listed them. So the food biosecurity imports, they do food for human consumption, human therapeutics, cultural heritage items and material. Horses, livestock and birds, it's pretty straightforward. They do horses, livestock and birds. They also do reproductive animals and reproductive material. The laboratory and human tissues team, they do any lab end-use commodities. Veterinary biologicals and animal feed team, like I said before, that's my team. We do animal feed, which includes pet food, aquaculture feed and stock feed. The veterinary biologicals includes veterinary therapeutics and veterinary vaccines. And then the environmental purpose stuff, which I'm going to cover off today, are the fertilizers, baits and bioremediation agents. And then we have our zoo and live companion animals team. So they do zoo animals, cats and dogs, and assistance animals. So generally we only interact with each other when we require advice from another team. So if we have like a cross commodity, we'll talk to each other. If we need advice for plant materials within these, then we'll reach out to the plant import operations. If a product contains only plant material, it will just be assessed by the plant import operations. So that's what we were trying to say at the start of this, that the bait might be related to me, but it could also be handled by the plant import operations side. So in the animal space, the main biosecurity risks we're addressing are the major animal health diseases. So I've listed a few of them here. These are just the big ones, but there are a few others as well. So the diseases on here that affect cattle are the bovine spongiform encephalopathy, foot and mouth disease, and lumpy skin disease. Sheep and goats are affected by foot and mouth disease as well, sheep and goat pox and scrapie. Pigs have African swine fever, classical swine fever, and foot and mouth disease. Deer are affected by chronic wasting disease and foot and mouth disease, and chickens, which I believe is a big one for Norfolk Island, they are affected by infectious bursal disease virus and highly pathogenic avian influenza. So when we're doing our assessments of these to the mainland, we're looking at different ways to manage these risks of the animal health diseases. So we do this in multiple ways. And I've included a few of them here. So we look at the material that's in the product, like whether it has animal, microbial or plant material. We look at the country of origin and the country of manufacture, so we can determine the disease status of the country that we're looking at. We look at the species of origin, so we know what diseases to be aware of during our assessment. Any processing like thermal, chemical or mechanical, because these can be sufficient to manage biosecurity risks of material from high-risk countries or just the high-risk material itself. Something else we look at is the type of packaging. So for example, like retail-ready packaging, so something that's going straight onto a supermarket shelf has a different biosecurity risk to something that's being imported in bulk material. And finally up here I've got target species or end use. So they essentially mean the same thing. A target species is used for in vivo and end use we use for in vitro. So for example, for a target species, it'd be like something that's going straight into a ruminant's mouth is going to be a higher risk than something going to a domestic dog or cat's mouth. For in vitro things like fertilizers, biorhymes and baits have a higher risk because of the end use, because they're going straight into the environment, which has a direct exposure risk to livestock animals, as opposed to something like a cleaning agent, which will be contained in a house and doesn't have that direct route of transmission. So with these products that contain these materials, we also look at potential for cross-contamination of material that could be infected with disease. So we also look at the manufacturing site and the raw materials that they use. In terms of Norfolk, Quinton touched on this, the legislation we work under is the Biosecurity Act 2015. Specifically the Biosecurity Prohibited and Conditionally Non-Prohibited Goods at Norfolk Island Determination 2016. That's a mouthful, so we just refer to it as the GD. I've included a snippet here. This isn't all of the items, this is just the first one. So as you may know, if the alternative conditions for the goods are in the GD and the conditions can be met, then an import permit is not required. If the conditions can't be met, or if they're not in the GD, then an import permit will be required, and the permit will list a specific set of conditions that we have applied. So in the terms where an import permit is required, we do an assessment of the products to be imported. In order to do our assessment for goods to Norfolk Island, we look at details on the commodity, on the manufacturer, on the ingredients, and we identify details of the applicant. Something that is useful for you guys to know is that this information can be obtained from packaging or the product label. The invoice can give you information on the manufacturer. You can get this information directly from the manufacturer, and if you're not able to get this information, then we ask that you provide us with a contact within the manufacturing company who we can liaise with. Due to commercial in confidence, this might be the preferred method from the company, and the department are more than happy to do that, and everything stays commercial in confidence. So now we're on to the part that's probably most important for you all to know, and that's the import conditions for these types of goods. So obviously we're at the stage where we know a valid import permit's required. On that permit, it will list the specific manufacturer that we have done our assessment of. The specific product names that you have applied for will be on the permit. It will say that the goods must be commercially prepared and packaged for retail sales. That means no further processing, like no blending, no repackaging. The goods must be exported directly from mainland Australia to Norfolk Island. So just say the goods were exported from Australia, stopped over in New Zealand, the seals were broken because they needed to unpack some things and then went to Norfolk Island, then we lose that reassurance and oversight of the biosecurity risk being managed due to potential contamination of goods in another country. We also have a restriction on the end use on our permits because that plays a big part in our biosecurity risk assessment, like I was saying before with the target species or the end use. So just say you did import something for, say, like a pet food, and you wanted to divert it to stock feed, you would have to contact the department for a change in end use. So for our goods, we don't have certification requirements on the permit, so you don't need to provide a manufacturer's declaration or a government certificate or anything like that, but you do still need to comply with the conditions on the permit. So in terms of outcomes, they're pretty simple. If there are no issues with the consignment, it will be released. If there is an issue detected, for example, like the product label presented doesn't match the product name that's on the permit, the goods will be exported or destroyed. Something really important to note is if you are unable to comply with the conditions on your permit, even if the permit has already been issued, please let us know as soon as possible so we can determine whether we can vary the permit conditions for you. This includes like if you notice that the product label actually doesn't match the product name on the permit, or where sampling must occur within a given time frame. If it can't be done within that certain time frame, please let us know so that we can try and help as quickly as possible and we're not stuck with clearance issues and varying import permits last minute. That's it for me, but our team can be contacted through the imports@agriculture.gov.au as well, or you can call the 1800 900 090 number. I think that works for Norfolk Island. Yeah, and if you have any questions for the live animal team, which I think a few of you did, or for reproductive material or anything, I'm happy to take those on notice, and I can give you probably fill up the direct email address for that team. They can take questions.
Thank you, Kiara. Okay.
That's okay.
And thank you, Quentin, as well. Really appreciate those presentations. I might now just take the opportunity to allow the audience here. We've got about 10 to 15 people here who've just listened to those presentations to perhaps feel any questions in relation to that you think you'd like some clarification on, or sort of questions unrelated to that you would like some advice on. What I'm going to try and do, just for Kiara, Stephanie and Quentin's sake, to use the microphone, because I think the audio otherwise is only coming through my computer, so it might be easiest if we use this.
Thanks, Phil. My question is to Quentin. Really, just to understand, noting the lack of treatment on arrival on Norfolk Island, what would be required in terms of making it easier for whether it be bare-rooted rootstock or whatever the case might be? What would be required in respect of post-entry quarantine on arrival on Norfolk Island in terms of equipment, processes, people, whatever that is? I'd be interested to understand. Thank you.
Yeah. So in terms of a PEQ on arrival, yeah, so obviously you need the infrastructure to have the facility. There is, so we have a separate area in the department, approved arrangements, and basically they will audit a facility in accordance with the goods that they're supposed to keep, and they have different classes essentially. So on our website, I don't know if I can quickly find the link, or maybe Steph can find the link while I'm talking and stick it in the chat, Philip, if that works.
It may. Either way, we'll share it with everyone, so that's fine.
Yeah, so basically they'll have an outlay of all the different classes for the different types of material. So say if you wanted to, have a PEQ, an approved arrangement that could take certain. Anyway, so the website I think is probably a good reference point in terms of approved arrangement facilities that can do certain things, and that covers off on like treatment. So say if you had a fumigator who wanted to do methylbromide fumigation, that comes under a class 4.6. And then there's an outlay, like I said, on the website that says here's all the sort of the key criteria that facility would need to meet. They'll need to be audited by the approved arrangements area and certified as such. So Steph's just chucked that into the chat. So that'll outlay those sort of key things that the department will look for. And then I think, don't quote me on this, but obviously I think for the fumigator themselves, they'll need to go through department training and certification as well to make sure that they can appropriately deliver that treatment as well. And then obviously the provisions around that for receiving the goods and how you dispose of goods to make sure that you are preserving the biosecurity status. I think, does that cover some of that? But, for imports into Australia, there are some pathways where, like medium risk non-tissue cultures, for instance, if you're importing from another country into our international border, if it's not tissue cultures, it will still require like a fumigation. So it'll undergo an inspection, like a methylbromide fumigation, and then there'll be like a 3 months PEQ requirement. So it will depend on the pathway, what the exact requirements are.
I guess my question more generally relates to, I guess conditions that have been imposed on Norfolk Island since 2015, and therefore, given that there is one of those primary requirements is that it come from mainland Australia. One assumes, therefore, that there are certain standards in terms of that material coming into Norfolk Island, notwithstanding any differences in terms of biosecurity status between mainland Australia and Norfolk Island. I guess my question would relate more to what is missing here on the island, and what are the impediments to seeing, if required, that infrastructure available here on the island to more readily and more easily enable plant material and other useful things to be able to be imported more readily? I guess that's the question.
Well, I guess it depends. So, if you're talking about why those conditions are being put in and them being of an impost to trade occurring, is that sort of the flavour of that question?
I think that is the
Yeah.
flavour of the question.
Well, I guess the probably easy answer to that is a combination of things, but it's a balance of maintaining your status because I'd posit, in fact, it's the case. Norfolk has its own pest and disease status and its own biosecurity status overall, and on one end of the spectrum, just like we would do for imports into Australia, you want to preserve that as much as is possible. And therefore, there's a set of conditions there to make sure that you're not getting anything nasty, you're not getting anything new. Like obviously that does happen from time to time. And without the provisions of having any sort of remediation on arrival for things to go, like, if we had, let's say, tissue cultures come in at the international border, come through Melbourne, and they would do the inspection, and that, if they find some stuff, there's a fairly standard set of measures that would apply to deal with it. So obviously we can just re-export, destroy, which is what's applied there. But we can sometimes go, well, one option is then instead of destroying it, we can PEQ it. But without a PEQ option over there, then you can't do that. And if you don't have, if you were to do, like, say, bare reeded, and you find, a whole bunch of thrips or pests or whatever, and you are not sure, because a lot of immature insects are pretty difficult to ID them, and you don't know whether at the species level whether you've got them or not. So often that stuff will get remediated. But again, if you don't have any, facilities to do that or capacity to do that on arrival, then the precautionary approach really is to treat it before it goes. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of stuff that you don't particularly want. And things like thrips too, like they can be pests themselves, but they can also be vectors of things that are particularly nasty. So I don't know. Is that answering the question?
It's more a policy question than a technical question, and yes, I'm not going to take it out any further. But yeah, it's more of a policy position.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't Norfolk Island have access to the same things that apply in other parts of regional Australia? That's really that's the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess that's a local question and a local choice and an investment, because I don't know the full history, so you can forgive me, but I think, there may or may not have been someone prior who could do some fumigation, but I don't know if it would have met necessarily all the requirements. Maybe I don't know if they did the training, but they would have to go through the certification. So someone's got to say that that's what they want to do, and they've got to invest their time and money into that, and that's got to be certified by the department. And then up and above that, if you want to do treatments on arrival, then someone's got to pay for a facility, and so that's an infrastructure investment, and then that needs to go through an accreditation and assessment component by the department. That's also.
I appreciate that. I guess is there not an obligation on agriculture? That's the question. We know who will pay for it ultimately, and that is infrastructure. But I guess the question would be: is there not an obligation? And there would obviously need to be a conversation. But is there not an obligation on agriculture to at least make what is required, make it aware what is required to be able to have a facility that would make access to Norfolk Island, the perception of risk, which is what it's all essentially about, make it more accessible on this island. That's really the question.
I can definitely understand that. That's definitely getting out of my sort of lunchbox a little bit there. I guess from our perspective here, it is more the technical, what's kind of happening now. And if the practicalities are that there's no PEQ and there's no treatment on arrival, then to preserve that biosecurity status, we've really got to mitigate those risks before it moves over. And that's just noting that you can't FUMO, you can't PEQ, your offices have limited diagnostic capacity. And so, so there's no choice in terms of the policy right here and now to deal with that before it goes.
Understood.
Yeah, but I do think you comment that I mean that's a bigger question and a broader question and a broader policy and a money and investment question. That's definitely not something that I have a lever over myself.
Hey Quentin, I'm not actually asking the question, I'm just basically trying to clarify things. Why we don't have these facilities here is they're very expensive to run properly.
Yes. Yeah.
They're incredibly expensive, they need a lot of diagnostic support. Australia actually only has one, and that's in Melbourne. And the only way you could sort of look at Norfolk having anything like that would be if there was some way of negotiating a portion of the Melbourne facility solely for export to Norfolk Island, because that's next to all the diagnosticians, all the diagnostic capacity, which in itself is very expensive for an incredibly small market. And so it's about, and the thing is, Australia doesn't have a huge number of the highly skilled diagnosticians needed to run these facilities. And so it's all about money and a very small market.
I don't want to labour the point here, but I guess my retort to that would be there is already a precondition that the material coming to Norfolk Island is coming from mainland Australia. So one would presume that there's certain thresholds that have been met before it would even be able to be considered for suitable for export to Norfolk Island, and so therefore, you know, why are the same conditions? Why are the same conditions that would be understandably, justifiably, absolutely required for importation into mainland Australia, when the material was coming from mainland Australia to Norfolk Island?
Simple. Norfolk Island is incredibly fortunate in having a very good biosecurity health status. There are a lot of plant pathogens, invertebrate, a whole lot of those things present in Australia that are not here and you do not want to get here. And therefore you have to go through the same process, because the threat to Norfolk Island is Australia. There's a huge number of plant pathogens there and pests there that we don't have and we can't manage here, because we have very limited resources to actually manage things once they get here. They'd pretty much wipe out agriculture here if we got some of those things here. So you do not want, you go through the same process.
Yeah, you're right. That's bang on, Glenn. But the only other thing I was just going to clarify, though, in terms of the AA, that one in Melbourne that you're talking about, the Miquelon facility, that's for high-risk nursery stock only. They also do animals, but that's for high-risk pathways. Now, for the majority of nursery stock imports, they really come under the medium-risk cases. They don't need to go through Melbourne. And so when stuff comes out of the port, you've got diagnosticians. So there'll be the inspectors, they'll find some stuff. Each of the regions have their own diagnosticians. And they'll determine, they'll basically help inform, this is what it is and what we need to do with a consignment. But for medium risk, it doesn't need to go to Miquelon. It just needs to go to usually like a 5.14 and a 6.1, I think it is, Steph. And they come under, they're usually private AA arrangements where things can be PEQ. And it's just a matter of someone's got enough money and is willing to go through the process of getting accredited that they can house those goods. So yeah, just making that distinction because they're two separate risk pathways.
I think it's the latter we're talking about. I mean, I don't think anybody's suggesting that a small island like this is going to need, like a multi-million-dollar facility like Melbourne's receiving. So I just wanted to
Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah,
Sorry, Quinn. In the interest of time, I just sort of wanted to give the opportunity for others to sort of ask perhaps completely different questions in relation to the process, particularly for importation of plant materials. Is there anyone who's sort of?
Mine was to do with it. I was just wondering why we have to get permits for something that somebody in Australia can just go and buy from a shop.
So if that was coming to Australia and that does have biological ingredients in it, that's going to need a permit for it to come in, and if manufactured overseas, we'll have gone through the risk assessment process of that.
There's slightly different risk assessments that we do for products manufactured in Australia versus when they're going to the external territories versus products that are manufactured overseas. Carrie did sort of touch on this, and it is a similar process when it has got animal ingredients versus when it's completely plant ingredients. So that's why what happens is if the goods determination, which we've sort of spoken about, if we don't have alternate conditions listed in there, then a permit's going to be required, and that's irrespective of what the product is or the end use. So that's probably the best place to start, with having a look within the Norfolk GD and see what information is in there and what products are covered in the alternate conditions. That's why the permit's required.
I don't understand that anyway.
I'll explain it later.
I think I had heard some comments earlier in the year that some of the conditions are a little too stringent for some of the mainland exporters to meet. And, you know, like we have been issuing permits, and we know there has been some trade that has actually occurred under those pathways. But I mean, if you've got specific things like that you think that our mainland exporters are saying, no, that's too hard or that's too hard, like, I mean, we're happy to receive that. You know, if you can tell us more specifically, like what's the actual condition that's causing the problem, and then we can sort of do a bit of digging on our end. But yeah, it can be just a bit difficult for us sometimes if we don't know like exactly like which condition is the problem.
Yeah. So you're saying, Quinn,
Yeah.
that, for example, if there was a particular supplier on the mainland of bear stock plant material that found it difficult in meeting the conditions that you put forward, that you would be willing to talk specifically about whatever that product is, or specifically with that supplier. Have I got that right?
Yeah. Well, I just think we would need clarity to go, because, you know, from our end, what we're seeing is we're getting permit applications for, you know, like we've had bear-rooted ones, and we've actually, because we know, we've had some trade that's actually occurred with that as well. So it's just, you know, I guess we're just trying to balance comments that say it's too stringent, but then noting that we know that some trade has actually occurred, so we don't know whether there's individual issues with individual suppliers, or, you know, maybe they don't want to facilitate it because of the volumes, like, you know what I mean? We're just trying to get at, like, what's the root problem? Is it actually that there's a legitimate problem, or is there something else there? So it helps us go, like, because, you know, if we get the comment saying it's too stringent, we just kind of need to know, like, what specifically is the problem, so we don't know, we can't do anything about it, essentially. So.
Okay, understood. All right. Thank you very much.